July 23rd at 2 p.m. and I'm sitting in the MCC with Marie Fyfe. So Marie, could you talk a little bit about what your job was at the bunker?
I was hired on a 2-year contract by the Army Signals, and that was in the days before our military services were integrated. So it was the Army that was responsible for the construction and the initial operation of this building. And the construction of the building was coming to an end. It wasn't completely finished, but the building was up and running roughly, and things were still being installed. And the communications network had a fair amount of work to do to connect it to other sites, both in the Ottawa Valley and across Canada, and to other places like NORAD and things like that. As I came from Manitoba Telephone System, I was placed in what was called SIGS 5B, which SIGS 5 is the engineering part of signals, and B was telephone engineering. And in that area, I had to draft contracts for equipment, examine the equipment when it came in or was installed in the bunker, check it over, although there was a formal assessment by a separate body called D&D Inspection Services to see that it conformed specifically to the letter of the contract. But I looked at it in terms of, is it going to operate to meet the requirements more generally? And I was basically looking at it from the position of the person who had attempted to draw up the contract to purchase it, although some of the contracts had been drawn up before I arrived. But I got involved in drawing up contracts for various other equipment here and for most of the bridge sites that were built, the telecommunications equipment. And I also had to design a few special circuits, interface circuits, things like that, connections to Kingston and Petawawa and odd things like that. And in addition, I participated in negotiating meetings with Bell Canada and Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Telecommunications, who carried the landline services out of the bunker. So we were occasionally packaged up by our leading officer and taken off to Montreal for a meeting at Beaver Hall Hill, or Hill Hall, I think. I can't remember which way it goes, to argue points out with Bell and that sort of thing. And I also traveled through the Ottawa Valley inspecting the installation of the buried cables, which connect the bunker to the, say, the transmitter site at Richardson, to the 2 remote antenna sites, and to the points where the buried communications came to the surface at Renfrew and Smith Falls, where it was interconnected to, as I said, Bell and CNCP Telecommunications. So I got, for a boy from Winnipeg, it was kind of nice. I not only got to see Ottawa, but I also got to see the Ottawa Valley. It was a good 2-year contract. Sorry it ended. So that was generally the framework. It covered a wide variety of things and interesting things.
Mm-hmm. And when you came in, did you live in the bunker or did you commute each day?
Just once. I stayed for 3 nights. I think it was, no, 2 nights. I think it was 2 nights. It's quite a while back. Mm-hmm. I was down on the 300 level, I think. No, 200 level. Room in the back there somewhere.
Mm-hmm. So was there anywhere then in the bunker that you weren't allowed to go at?
Oh yes, there were lots of places that it was on a need to be there basis. And for example, the crypto area, just along the hall here, you weren't allowed in there. But I did get into some places that I wouldn't normally have seen, because if they had problems with some of the internal telephone cabling, they'd say, oh, there's a telephone engineer on site, go and get him. And I was supposed to be able to look at this stuff and say what was wrong. So I got into the Strad room and the routing line segregator, which was on this level, on the 400 level at that time. That was before computers, of course. And I saw that. That was an incredible thing for generating CHAD, which is like small confetti, the holes in punched paper tape. The floor was just covered in the stuff, but an incredible thing. And of course, I also saw the Federal Warning Center. I was in there several times, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I saw that on the screens. So did a lot of people from Parliament Hill. They came out and you could barely get in the hallway. There were all these visitors watching what amounted to not very much, actually, but they'd all heard you could see the tracks of aerial traffic around Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis if you went out to the bunker and looked in on the Federal Warning Center. So it was a period there when there were some fair quantities of visitors from Parliament Hill, I guess, executive assistants and all that sort of stuff.
Was anyone allowed in at that point to come and see, or was it certain people?
Well, I think it would be people that could swing a reason to get in. I mean, I don't know who they were, but there were certainly crowds of them. And then eventually, I think during the height of the crisis, it was closed. But for the first period of time, it was open. There's another fellow that works here as a volunteer. He worked installing the Strad, and he was in during that time. I remember talking to him about that. People get confused and they think that the bunker was totally closed during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it wasn't. I think it was only for about 3 or 4 days during the height of the crisis. And they're perhaps confusing it with the lockdown test that occurred roughly a month earlier, which would be in the late summer, early fall, August, September timeframe of 1962, when the building underwent an acceptance test. So I'd arrived in the spring of that year, and then they'd got to the point where they were trying to rush it through and get it going, that they felt it was ready for a test. So they went in with a full complement of mainly signals personnel, plus the necessary cooks and mechanical engineers and that to run things, and shut it down for 2 weeks. And it had to run the way it was supposed to run for this 2-week period. And of course, nobody else was allowed in during that time. It was just closed down totally as if there had been an atomic attack. It passed the test and it was deemed acceptable. So shortly after that, it was announced that it was going to be accepted from the primary supplier, which was Foundation Engineering of Canada. And it was turned over at that time from command under engineering officer, Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, I think it was, who were in charge of the building during its construction. But becoming operational, then it was turned over to a signals officer, Major McDougall, who was the first operational commanding officer. And then it was just shortly after that the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. So it was kind of like practice preparing for the crisis. It's quite interesting. So they had some good experience there in a short period of time.
And how did you find it being in this lockdown situation in the bunker?
Well, I wasn't in during the 2-week test. That was only the operational people. I mean, I was extraneous. I was a contract engineer, There were no civilians in at the time. They were all just signals, the operating telecommunications staff, and then the building engineers who run the diesel generators, the ventilating systems and all that, cooks and that sort of thing, because, you had to have your food and whatever was required to operate the building in a sense of being in a nuclear crisis situation. So it was closed up tight with the normal complement of people. The only thing that was lacking, of course, was government people, the people that would be here in a real situation. That was the building's main purpose, to house a portion of the government, of course. So it was just the military side, the operational people that were in at that time. But it passed and they accepted it. And although there were things to do, because that was, I hadn't been here 6 months when that occurred. And there was still a fair amount of installation work going on after that. Not just in telecoms, there was other things. I just don't remember the exact things, but there were miscellaneous things. In the telecoms area, though, we were still burying cable. We had all the connections in place out to the various sites. I know it was some time after that I went out and saw it was number 1 line troop from Kingston that did a lot of the burial. They called into the office one day, and my office was in B building in the old National Defense Headquarters on Cartier Square, buildings which are thankfully now gone. They were incredible things. You could roast in the summer and freeze in the winter in those things. The officer in charge of 5B got a call from the line troop out on the site toward Carleton Place saying that they had lost pressure on a gas bottle that they put on a cable. When you bury a cable, you put a temporary cap on the end of it with an attachment that feeds gas in it to keep the cable pressurized while it's laying in the trench, so that if it rains and it gets water in the trench, you don't get water in the cable. And when they came back the next day, the gas bottle was empty, and they were really puzzled by this until they asked me to go out or send somebody out. So I went out, but by the time I got out there, they had discovered why. There was about, I think, 20 feet of the cable there, and then after that, it was gone. Somebody had come in and chopped it off and stolen it. It was lead sheath cable in those days, and lead had a good value on the scrap market. And of course, all the wires, all the conductors in it are copper, and that's another good metal to sell on the scrap market. I don't remember exactly how many feet were stolen, but it was in the neighborhood of 300 or 400 feet, I think. It was a fair chunk. They must have had a big truck and a number of people to do it because it would weigh a lot. And I can remember putting through the contract for purchase of another reel of cable. But so we were still burying cable, and that would have been, I guess, spring '63, roughly. So you can see the telecom side was still somewhat behind. Well, it had a lot to do with it because there was a huge web of connections to be put in place. So that's one small memory, anyway, of the time, an interesting thing that occurred.
What were your first thoughts when you heard about your assignment to the bunker?
Well, I had answered an ad in the newspaper in Winnipeg that I just forget the exact wording about working on something like a military project, and that sounds interesting, And I know it's 2 years, but it'd be a nice change. You'd take a chance. And I was flown down for an interview. There were about 6 or 7 of us. We were actually hired by a company called Philco Corporation, who had a business primarily in the US, but also in Canada, of supplying technical personnel to mainly the military. And so they'd taken on this job to supply technical personnel to the Army signals. And so they gathered the people together from across Canada, these 6 or 7 of us, and took us all into the office of it was Lieutenant Colonel Bob Scott was in head of SIGS 5. And we were all interviewed by him. And I think because I was a telephone engineer, I was put in the telephone engineering section, and I didn't really know the details of the project until I came back, to start my work. And then I found out that it was this hush-hush, and it was then referred to as EASE, E-A-S-E, Experimental Army Signals Establishment, because the government was trying to keep it quiet, and they didn't succeed, of course. We have these photographs taken by a reporter from a newspaper, aerial photographs and stuff like that it had all leaked out. But it was about that time that I realized exactly what it was, because there wasn't much news about it in the newspaper. Locally, there was a little bit, in Ottawa papers, what's the government doing out there and that sort of thing. But elsewhere, nobody knew anything about it. So it was a bit of a surprise, and I was brought out on a visit within about a week of arriving, and just conducted through some of the spots and shown the things like where the telephone exchange would be, et cetera, and it looked like it was going to be an interesting time. Yeah.
And could you describe what a typical day was, or the security and things like meal times, where you would normally go in the bunker?
Oh, yeah. Well, when you arrived at the bunker, you had to come into the guard entrance desk and sign in. And there were 2 just scribblers, as I recall them. One was for military and one was for civilian. And you had to sign in the right scribble, your usual thing, name, time, and that sort of stuff. But everybody was coming in the morning. Like if you got in at the same time, or if you happened to ride the bus from downtown, you had all these half asleep people coming in, and we're all in a line, and so we were forever signing in on the wrong book. We would forget to shift over. If you were standing behind a military guy, you'd sign in on the military book. If a military guy was standing behind you, he'd sign in the civilian book, and they were always at us, guys, wake up. After signing in, I normally made my office, so to speak, in the telephone exchange, because that's where most of the things were going on. I'd find out how things are going, what equipment had been installed, how it was working, and that sort of thing, have a good look at it. I even come in here just to keep in touch with it, even if I was going out further on out to look at some of the cable burial operations. Or I had to do a number of trips to Petawawa, look at interconnections up there, things like that. But I would usually stop in at the bunker. Without getting into technical details, I looked at equipment and, listened to what the people had to say that were operating it. And then I got into designing a few specialized circuits. So then, of course, I had to come in and see that it was installed properly and then run tests on it. Generally, it's that type of day. You're working with what now is very old-style telecoms equipment. But like the telephone exchange room now it's less than half the size that it used to be, because it had to house a big old step switch thing, a telephone exchange that served the building. And now you can mount that whole thing in a box on the wall, a small box on the wall. But it was quite large then. And right next to it was a 3-position manual switchboard, because all external calls, except for one dial line to downtown, all external calls had to go through an operator. It was manned 24 hours a day. So it was that, just like out of the movies, what number do you want, and plugging in the cords and things like that. Very old style, because the bunker was built at a time when a lot of technology was changing. We hadn't got to miniaturization or solid state. It was still just the tail end of the old electromagnetic relays and all that sort of stuff. Then they were being stretched to and beyond their limit. It's unfortunate the bunker hadn't been built a bit later, because you could see that, I guess must have been within 10 years they'd replaced the Strad system, which was a mixture of discrete transistors and electromagnetic relays. They'd replaced the routing line segregator, which was all relays and teletype machines, with computers. And computers were around when the bunker was being built, but they were big mainframes. IBM and General Electric and places like that had them. And they hadn't really got down small enough in size to be used by casual businesses. The year I graduated, which was 1960, we were given a computer which was the size of a large fridge. And it had 5K of memory, 5K. And you can imagine, not many years after that, I had one of the first home computers, a TI 994A, which was this size, and it had 20K of memory. And then after that, we just boomed away until we're all now talking about, megs and gigs of RAM and stuff like that. But at the time the bunker was being built, that was where technology was. Like the announcement machines at the guard desk were, as I recall, 8-track tape. You may not even know what 8-track tape is. It just briefly preceded audio cassettes. It was designed primarily for use in cars. It was an El Cheapo system. It had very poor quality reproduction, but that's what they had. And they had 2 of them in there. There'd be one tape would be the warning announcements, and the other tape machine contained the clearing announcements, and it was also the backup machine. So you can see the bunker was just on the edge of technological change, and so it got stuck with all this old stuff, the best of the old stuff, but still, it was old stuff. I came in one day, I was actually going to go to Petawawa, I think. So I'd driven out. I'd been in the office in the morning, and I came out at the end of lunch. And I came in with a group of others that were coming back from lunch. And we were stopped at the doorway. We could smell smoke. And we were told that there's been some kind of fire and you can't go in, you'll have to wait here. And I had only intended to do my usual drop in to see how things were before I headed up the valley to Petawawa. But we were only out there about 20 or 30 minutes. They said, okay, you can go in now. And I went around I turn to my right and then to my left, so I'm on that far side of this top level to get to the telephone exchange. And as I go around the hallway, the smell of the smoke became stronger and stronger. And oh goodness! And when I stepped into the exchange, this is it. And sure enough, there'd been a fire in the telephone equipment. Without getting too technical, there's a system called N carrier, which provides extra circuits on top of a pair of wires. And there were several bays of that in there. One bay feeding Renfrew and the other feeding Smith Falls. And one of them, I just forget which, the power supply in it had overheated and caught on fire. And they had put as much as they could of the fire out with the single fire extinguisher that was there. But the extinguisher, it was empty before the fire was completely out. So a quick thinking Siggs type threw his, I think it was his uniform jacket or pants over the remainder of the fire and smothered it. And he just brought them back from the cleaners. It's nice thinking, but expensive. That's another incident, a technical day at the bunker.
Yeah. Were you ever here for meal times? Did you use the cafeteria?
Oh yes, food was good here, very good. Because they had to have a supply of fresh food for, what was it, a week or 10 days or something like that. And then they would go to these dried ration things, the military rations. The only way they could keep the food fresh was use it all the time. And so everybody that was in the bunker got all this food. And because it was food that had to be there just in case the nuclear thing came and the government came, you had to have good food, all that sort of stuff. So prime rib and things like this. We ate like kings. And it was very popular to be here in the bunker at mealtime. And they were always, the regular ones here were always saying, oh, here comes another moocher from Parliament Hill, But you would, the officers had a mess on level 300. That's 300? I think, yeah, 300. I think it's marked there now. And so you'd go over there and you could have a glass of sherry or something like that before you went down for lunch. And you're always dragging your feet to get downstairs, and the cafeteria closed at 1, and at about 5 to 1, the officers would come, we all come streaming out of the mess and down the flight of stairs to the big cafeteria thing in there. And I suppose that all the chefs were looking there, here they come again, right at the last minute on these guys. But it was good food, really great. Yeah, I enjoyed that too, because I was on my own, so it was far better than my cooking.
What about the other people who were working in the bunker? Did you get to know them very well, and which types of people did you know?
A fair number of them. I got to know a few that were more involved with the telecom side, of course, including though the one in charge of the Federal Warning Center at that time, and also the fellow that was in charge of the Strat equipment. Apart from that, I got to know the officer I worked for at first, Ed Wade, was the captain, and then he left to go on course, and we got another one in, Jerry Dawson, Major, who'd come back from the Congo. And then the last one was Larry Hamilton. So, they keep posting people on you all the time. But one thing I found about working with the people, the military people here, was that they were very, very easy to get to talk to, and very nice, good conversation. I think it's part of what they have to be because of their lifestyle, this posting everywhere. But I remember very pleasantly my memories and my associations with the people here. They were just easy to talk to, friendly, helpful. It was a great bunch. It really was a good experience that way. A lot of people, were all involved in this great thing, and it had a nice feel to it. So they're all a good bunch. I got instructions on how to do physical exercises from one who was into that, and I got stories of the Northwest telecommunications operation that were run by the Army up in the Yukon before it became a public commercial system, because one of the officers here had been up there in that one. And I was like, all this different information and things, interesting things. They were a great bunch, really. But you didn't see a lot of them all the time because they were busy doing their thing, you know. And as I say, when I was taken because of a cabling problem to Seastrand, it was this one particular officer who took me there. That was his area. And that's how I got to see a little bit more than perhaps I would have otherwise. I also managed to see down in the diesel room. This was another place they had problems with. I think it was a connection down there. And I sat down there in that so-called soundproofed control cabinet that they had down there, and then the diesel started, you know, and there's got to be more to soundproofing than this, you know. That was, you know, you couldn't hear yourself think. I hate to have been outside without the cabinet, but it was noisy. So I got to these other places here and there in the building that weren't quite the normal thing to do. A lot of other people didn't get into it, but I had brief glimpses of them anyway.
And just generally speaking about your memories of the bunker, do you have any favorite stories that you like to tell, or memories that stand out to you?
Well, I think I've mentioned a few. There weren't too many great events, but you know, you were working, and I would come in and out. I was half like a ghost, I guess. You know, he's here today and he's not, because I didn't spend all my time here. I had to spend a large amount of time down in the Cartier Square offices because there's contracts that drop, and then when the answers to the contracts came in, they'd be all sent over. These bids would be sent over, and they were on a standard form with the prices clipped off, and you were supposed to do an engineering-only assessment, some figment of a bureaucrat's mind. But anyway, I spent a lot of time down there doing that. But I guess on the average, I was out here 1 to 2 days a week or through here. So I didn't see the people that much. These events that occurred, like the theft of the cable, you know, there's one in many, and then another one that they fire. But there weren't that many astounding things that happened. It was working life. Yeah. I got into the Richardson transmitter site too. That was an interesting place. Nothing astounding happened, but it was nice to see that one place where we were feeding cables to. An unusual building. That one now, of course, is closed. It's sealed, and it's probably half flooded, I would guess, because they had to run pumps there all the time. It's within the water table.
Okay, so that's the end of the first section of questions. There's 3. So to start off on the second, what effect, if any, do you feel that the Cold War had on your day-to-day life and your life in the bunker working?
I think I became more aware of military activity in Canada in general and what it meant to us. You know, we're all familiar with the fact we have a military and they do this, that, and the next thing. But when you're working with them on a specific project, you find that they have goals that they've had to set themselves for this job, and the goals relate very much to what Parliament wants, what the government wants, and that sort of thing. So they're not unlike the civilian side of government. They march to a government tune, you know, but they have to carry it out in a military preparedness role. It was quite good to see that, and I think that stayed with me. So it's probably colored my thinking, and I probably have perhaps a bit more of an appreciation for the importance of the military and what they do than I would have otherwise had without this experience. I know the Cold War stayed with me, and to the point where when I retired, it became an area of interest to me, and I've done a considerable amount of reading about it. So, you know, to see where all of this was going on, because of course it was underway when I was, and this building was started when I was just barely graduating. So a lot of the things that had caused this building to come into being had occurred, and I was kind of locked up. When you're studying engineering, you don't have much time to even breathe, you know. So I didn't pay too much attention to the current events until after I got out of university. And this brought it all home to me. And then when I retired, as I say, I read a lot more because I was interested in the background to, first of all, the bunker, and then the Cold War itself. And it was interesting to find a lot of different opinions on what the Cold War was, why we'd had it, and that sort of thing. And I think some of the books that are written on it are too narrowly focused. They didn't really realize, they didn't show that they really realized what was going on. Like so many of them seemed to think that it was simply a struggle over an atomic bomb, which is not correct. It wasn't that. It was a battle like it has been over the centuries. Many times the Cold War is not new. It may be a relatively new term, but there have been Cold Wars back centuries ago. Where two major groups are at loggerheads over something, but they won't go to war because they're roughly similar in strength, and they're afraid they'll do themselves in. They might not win, and that's a typical Cold War situation. But they're not fighting over the weapons. The weapons are simply the thing they use to carry on this nonsense. They're fighting over usually an ideological difference of opinion, and that's what this Cold War was. It was the difference between democracy and totalitarianism, which was represented by communism. Fascism had come and was on its way out. The communists were there, and so it wasn't the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was simply the weapon of convenience, the one that they had to have to maintain that stalemate balance. But it was the ideological difference that was the heart of it all. And that started way before they got into the bunker. It started way back in the 20s and 30s, before most people realized there was such a thing as atomic power. So it really had nothing to do with the atomic bomb beyond, as I say, that became the weapon of choice. And seeing it in that light, I think, helps understand why some of the things were done. Because you didn't know to what extent people would be driven by these extreme beliefs. Like I think it's somewhere in the Marx manifesto that it states, and that we have to carry this message to all the peoples of the world. We have to liberate everybody. And so you can interpret that if you're over on the Democratic side and say, oh, they're going to go to war with us there, And so I think there was a very real fear that developed, and a very sensible and rational fear of what the other side might do. And it wasn't until both sides got far enough down in the game that both sides by then had developed their atomic capabilities, and they started to realize just what atomic power would do and how devastating it was, that there started to be some other thinking, some cooler heads coming in and say, oh goodness, pushing the button, even if we've got more bombs than they have, isn't going to do us a lot of good, But until they got to that point, there was a danger, a very real danger. There was the incident where something, I just don't remember exactly what had happened, but it was something to do with communications and some aircraft flying, but the Russians were on the verge, and they had a statement from the Russian, I think he was a lieutenant colonel that was in charge of their button, so to speak, to that part of their operation. And he said he was within minutes of pushing the button to set things in motion because of the Russian concern with what was going on the other side. And there was some stuff on that in here in the bunker somewhere. I just don't remember where it is. But it's that sort of thing. You were that close. And a lot of people did die, of course. We had the Russian submarine sank. Well, there was an American submarine sank. Most of the crew were rescued, but I think the rescue submarine lost a few crew. There's the U.S. Stratofortress that went down in northern BC. Part of that crew died. And then there were odd ones here and there. And I suppose there was the odd spy doing the other odd spy in, that sort of stuff. So it was real. It was real.
Did you feel at the time, did you have that sense of fear, or did anyone else around you here at the bunker or where you were living, people that you knew, did anyone had this sense of fear of communism and the nuclear attack?
Yeah, you'd encounter it. It's human nature. There'll be variations in it, and some people would be quite concerned about it, and others, oh, it won't happen. I think generally everybody said we have to do. The main thinking was, well, we have to do something to be prepared, and that's why most people supported the cost of doing things like this. They went to the drills when you had the sirens. We had all these sirens all over Canada. We have the examples outside the front door and here. We went through all of that, and most people, I think, accepted that there could be a need for this, and we better just to be sure, we better go through with it all. But when it got to more extensive preparations, like building yourself a shelter in your cellar, well, not so many people were quite that stricken with the idea. This is getting pretty heavy going, But there was still, if not fear, a great deal of concern anyway. But I think it wasn't misplaced. There was a potential for something happening. Both sides had set off atomic bombs, and they learned the hard way that there was radiation, and they finally figured out what killed Marie Curie long after it happened. That strange stuff. And then they had their race to build the biggest one. As far as I know, the Russians detonated the largest test explosion ever. And they chased each other around the oceans and around the skies and all the time. You could see, for example, in the Federal Warning Center, tracks of Soviet Bear bombers across the Arctic. They were there regularly. And that's one of the things that the people here would see. They would come in the radar plot and put it up on the screen, and there it is. It's going past Cambridge Bay or something like that. So they were very busy, both sides, all the time. And most people, I think, had considerable concern, and it, as I say, in some cases it extended to fear. In other cases it was complacency. But I think it was all rational. It was sensible. It had to be done because it was in doing it, in preparing defenses, and this applies to both sides. In preparing the defenses, it gradually led to this thinking, recognizing the power of the atomic bomb. That we prepared as best we can. They prepared. What are we going to get out of this? We better find another way, rather than throwing stuff at each other. So it gradually simmered down.
What about your family? What was their response to hearing that you were starting work at the bunker, and how did you talk about your work to them?
Well, I was on my own at the time. I eventually told my parents I was working on this government project, but we weren't supposed to say much. I don't remember the exact details of it, but we were told not to talk too much about it. And that you were doing contract engineering for the Army Signal Corps. That was about it. But I told my parents that I was working on, and it was starting to get into the news a little bit, and I said, I was working on that thing, that special thing, no details. And so I didn't tell them I'm spending days in an underground building or anything like that. Not that it bothered me, but...
Do you remember the reactions of those around you who may have been married or had young families about learning that they couldn't bring their families in if there was some sort of emergency?
No, the people that were in here that I dealt with were all the military people, and they knew that from the word go. If they were posted in there, it was them that was there, and that was it. And I don't recall any specific discussions. There probably were, but I don't think there was anything that bothered them about that. That's part of their life. I mean, if they were sent to Afghanistan, they don't have their family with them. So that's their life. They're much better at dealing with that, much more accustomed to that concept than, for example, a senior bureaucrat who would be assigned to the bunker in case of the atomic bomb would be told, just you, not your family. Now, what those people thought, I don't know, but I would imagine that some of them were too keen on the idea. I understand that Diefenbunker said he wasn't going to go without his wife, something like that. He didn't come here anyway, so.
Just to go back just for a minute to you talking about the sense of anxiety that moved to complacency between certain people. Did your work at the bunker ever increase that sense of concern for you, or did it reassure you to know that this was here?
Well, I think I felt better in knowing that Canada was doing things to ensure the continuity of government as much as it could to help people deal with it. I think that's sort of a logical conclusion. Once you've accepted the fact that there is a real danger, then and you're involved in doing something to deal with that danger, then you sort of support the whole thing. It's yes, we have to do this. It's unfortunate, but and I'm glad I'm involved in it. And as far as my direct work was concerned, there was an element of urgency because the telecoms was it by necessity had to be later in the game to get it all in, and it was a very, very critical part at the same time of what the government needed in order to operate, to continue to operate. Had there been an atomic attack, they needed major communication links all over the place, or you can't stay in touch with the country, you can't stay in touch with the people. Remembering that this building wasn't intended as a combat operation. It was a continuity of government function, how to deal with people that might be affected, evacuation routes, emergency supplies, et cetera, all those sorts of things. And you had to have not only the government people that could deal with that here, but you had to have the ability to communicate, to find out what was going on and to say what could be done, to communicate all over the country all the time, as well as get the information as to what was going on outside Canada and bring that into the radar tracking, et cetera, et cetera. So communications was a very, very key part of it, a very big part of it. And it was, I could see why they brought this group of 6 or 7 of us on toward the end of the period, because they were, I guess, feeling the pressure to get it done, because the building was at that point coming close to completion and the communications still had a ways to go. You could get a certain amount of things in, but there was a lot of the ability to communicate to the provinces, and that was still not fully in place. And the systems that were being put in were redundant systems. They had 2 different main routes out. They had carriage contracts with both Bell and CNCP, so that the circuits were split between the 2 of them, so that if one company's system got damaged, then the other one could hopefully carry through. And then you had a 3rd level of redundancy in that a lot of these circuits were backed up by direct radio links to the various sites, which was the reason for the Richardson transmitter site and the 2 receiver sites. So you had, in effect, triple level redundancy. And in later years, they actually put in a ham operation, so they thought, if worst comes to worst, maybe the ham things can get through, and so 4 levels of redundancy, maybe. So communications was a very, very big part of it, and you were aware of that you want to get this job done. And that's why there was such a push all the time to keep things rolling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the 3rd section left here. Could you talk a little bit about any sort of significant Cold War related news stories from the time that you might remember, or were there any?
There was very little, actually. A lot of that stuff was hush-hush, it was not released to the public. I've subsequently read a lot about it, but during the time, very little. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was, of course, public to a fair extent, and the Kennedy telling the Russians to get their missiles out of Cuba was public, and everybody was on tenterhooks at that particular point for a few days. But I don't recall any other events like that. For example, that crash of the Stratofortress that was carrying the atomic bomb, the crash in northern BC, that was kept quiet for a long period of time. And because first of all, they thought the plane had gone down in the Pacific Ocean, which was the crew's intention when the engines failed. They pointed it east, but unfortunately the prevailing winds are coming this way onto land. I guess the plane got turned around and came in, and when the fuel ran out, it plowed into the mountains in BC. When it was found, which was several years later, the Americans were in there very quickly. What diplomatic arrangements they made, if any, I don't know, but it was fast because they were concerned that there could be classified equipment on it. And it was a few years later before Canadians got in to see it. So I understand. So there wasn't a great deal of public information. But when you look back and you see the stuff that's been dredged up by various enterprising analysts out of documents of having been released now, then there were a lot of incidents going on. Like undersea tracking was phenomenal. You know, the U.S. actually got in and by submarine and tapped the cables in Russia, the undersea cables. And they had to go and visit because of the technology at the time. They had to visit this equipment regularly. I think it had like tape recorders in it undersea. So it had to be taken off and new tapes put in. They followed submarines all over. There was a Russian submarine that, I just forget the exact reason for the accident, but it sank. And they used Howard Hughes' famous Glomar Explorer ship to raise part of it. Eventually, but that whole mission was some kind of a scientific survey they were doing. So even then, you know, they weren't telling much about anything at all. So I don't recall back in those days much in the news. You know, Canada's putting in more air raid sirens, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and there was a brief item in the newspaper. A group of officers and men emerged after a 2-week lockdown in an underground building near Carp, Ontario, you know, when they did the lockdown test. But it was brief, you know, very, very small things.
What did you know about the Soviet Union at the time?
Well, I guess not a great deal. It wasn't a focus of my attention. You know, I haven't been recently in engineering, but it was I guess generally viewed as a big bad bear, you know, that sort of thing. Kind of mysterious, quite dangerous, but very powerful in terms of they threw all the people at you, they'd trample you to death. You know, there was a huge population, like the way they'd done to the Germans in the Battle of Leningrad. So, you know, there was a fair amount of respect for Russia, but also I think a concern that they weren't really maybe even as civilized as we were, you know, something odd like that. But you didn't know much, not much. Mm. I remember the Guzenko affair, that one, when that came out. Mm. People had a hard time believing that sort of thing could be going on in dear old Canada, you know, that, oh, not here, you know, that sort of thing. He's run away with all those papers, and the government wouldn't have anything to do with him at first, you know. Oh, no, we don't want to know about it, you know. Oh, strange. But it sort of popped the lid on a can of worms in North America, didn't it? So we were living in a time of innocence, I think. Kind of nice. We're isolated out here. We're okay. Mm-hmm. People didn't even realize then, to any significant extent, although some did, that there'd been German submarine attacks in the St. Lawrence River. They didn't know that. They didn't know about the German weather station on the Labrador coast, you know, all these bits and pieces. But, and yet, if you read through all of the sinkings, I'm sure maritimers must have known, because there were a lot of them, a lot of ships sunk in the Gulf. Canadian ships, convoy ships, and the Caribou Ferry, of course, you know. There were things there that people should have realized, that the war is a lot closer than you think. There were bits and pieces, but and until Gusenko came along, there wasn't any real feeling that Canada had been, or was it, they were attempting to infiltrate Canada to any extent.
Mhm. What did you feel, or do you feel now, was Canada's role in the Cold War? Were we important, do you think?
Yes, I think Canada played a fairly important role. I mean, it wasn't certainly one of the major players, but it did play a role in the Cold War. It backed into it, and it was through the Gusenko affair, or you saw it through the Gusenko affair. It started earlier when Canada started training people to do behind the lines work in enemy countries and things like that, and they had opened up the training camp on the shores of the St. Lawrence River down, it's near Brockville. And then after they closed that down, that was where Gusenko was finally taken to and kept hidden there for a while. But during the period it operated, that camp operated, Camp X it was called, it was from about 1941 to 1943 or 4. It was started primarily by the British to train people to go in behind lines, and to also, though, to provide to a segment of the U.S. government that felt that they should be involved in the war, and they weren't at that time, some assistance with training people that would be able to analyze what was going on and act on it. And the Americans couldn't train people in that sort of thing at home because they were ostensibly a neutral country. But Canada was just a hop, step, jump away. So that was done in Canada at Camp X. And then it gradually developed into much more than that, where they were training large quantities of people to go all over the place. But they also established a major radio link with the UK. And it was through that radio link and its continuation after the importance of Camp X in training people diminished, because the Americans went into the war and they started to train their own people, that Camp X's transmitter was used to monitor. It could monitor long-wave transmissions all around the world, and it picked up submarine transmissions and that sort of stuff. But it also trained spies that went in the early parts of the Cold War after World War II. They went into Albania and places like that. So they were involved in the beginning. So Canada played that role, and it also, in doing that thing, that whole Camp X thing, it brought Canada in on the sort of the coattails of the US and Britain when they met and talked and that. So Canada was involved in it. I think it was a reasonably important thing. But as I say, it wasn't a major player. But it wasn't until Canada encountered the Gusenko situation that they realized, we're really in this, this is, we're part of this mess. Yeah.
What was your reaction to hearing about the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Oh, I was surprised. I thought that's, I mean, great. But, wow. And then when you think of it, you look back at, and particularly if you go back and look at other things that were going on, you could see that there was a weakening, both economic and in terms of determination on the part of I think the communist side, that they were having a tough time keeping things together. And so it was almost inevitable, perhaps, you might put it that way. I mean, look what happened to Gorbachev. Eventually, he wanted to do something that was a bit better, a bit more open, and it was a slippery slope. And he went out, but so did communism. It was all there. It was crumbling because I think they'd strained their economy beyond belief by trying to have false levels of currency and all this sort of stuff. So the whole thing was a mess. So when the Berlin Wall went, oh, and then when you look back and say, yeah, but there was some logic to it. It was going to happen. It was an interesting time, though.
Just one last question to wrap up. Why do you think it's important to remember the Cold War and your experiences?
Well, humans beings, being what they are, they tend to have short memories. And you'll find people going out and saying, no, the best way to do this is going to shoot them up, and it seems to be something that as of yet, has not been removed from human nature. The caveman days are still there, embedded in us or something. So you need things to show people what you have to go through. You know, at the very least, just think of what your taxes will be like if you want to pay for all this stuff. But that's what you have to do. And beyond that, you know, and people died. People did die. And you really want that. I'd rather see a few diplomats having a bunch of good parties with lots of things to drink and eat and stuff like that than having a bunch of people shooting and killing themselves. It's a far better way of doing it, you know. Yeah.